What did you learn about risk at a whorehouse?
It's a very risky job, especially if you're working in the illegal market. There's always a risk that your client could be the police or just a deranged lunatic who will kill you.
Allison Schrager is the author of An Economist Walks Into a Brothel, a fascinating dive into how different communities assess risk and what we can learn from them, including sex workers at the Moonlite Bunny Ranch in Nevada.
I went to the brothel to see how the legal market manages risk, because the legal market provides a fairly risk-free space to do sex work, where the women have security, where they don't have to worry about screening their clients, and they go through thorough background checks and disease screenings and have a lot of support.
Their risk is minimized, and then also the risk for the Johns is also minimized.
Exactly, and that's actually, it's sort of an interesting play on pimp. I guess Dennis Hoff, when he was alive, loved sort of reclaiming the expression pimp. Because when I think of a pimp, I think of this guy who's pushing these women into these very dangerous situations and then taking all the money. So we call that in finance like an unsensible risk. You generally, in finance, people who take more risk are supposed to get more reward. And you know a market isn't functioning properly when the people who take the biggest risks don't get the biggest reward, which happens often in crime because they're sort of messed up markets for a lot of reasons. So what's interesting about what Dennis does is he actually makes his spread, you know, what the Johns pay and what the women have to pay to minimize risk or reduce risk for everyone involved in the transaction. He is sort of a pioneer in the world of sex work. He was running some sort of business with timeshares and just had a lot of friends in the porn industry and spent time in brothels and had this idea that you could approach sex work the way you approach timeshares.
It's like a total ripoff, is what you're saying.
I think it's a fair transaction. You know, you're not locked in like you are with a timeshare. You're not stuck seeing these sex workers year after year. And it's not like you have to then sell your time with them somewhere else. But the idea is that you are effectively renting someone. Or renting a service, I guess is a nicer way to think about it. Nevada has a long history with legal sex work. Before, you know, they were kind of dingy, sort of depressing places. They're not like luxury spas. The women there were, you know, having to be there for hours or days at a time where they weren't allowed to leave. There were set prices. They had no control over who they were servicing. So we had this idea that he was going to make them all independent businesswomen and that they would negotiate every transaction on their own terms, only have sex with people they wanted to, and set the prices themselves.
To meet with the world's most interesting risk takers, Schrager traveled the country to study horse breeders, military commanders, professional poker players, and Hollywood paparazzi. On Hawaii's North Shore, she found herself attending the annual Big Wave Risk Assessment Safety Summit, where she found that surfers and financial risk advisors have a lot in common.
Their leader is this guy named Brian Kirlana, who had this idea that risk is something that could be managed, which is the whole ethos of financial economics. So he had the same idea, and he's been studying risk science with the military and had this idea that they would regularly have these summits where they would discuss risk science, but for big wave surfers. And they really discuss a lot of the same things we do in pension conferences. Different ways you can minimize risk, manage risk, take risk in smarter ways. For instance, waves travel in sets. So big waves will run in a pack of 5. In finance, we'd call this a hedge, which is taking less risk, but still getting some reward and sort of calibrating it just so. So you never want to take an early wave in a set, because if you wipe out, there'll be 4 or 5 large waves barreling on you. So you want to do is take a wave in the 4th or 5th set. Anyway, that might be a smaller wave, just so you have less risk. So they talk about things like that.
These guys are not necessarily adrenaline junkies, or what they do is risky, but they're not big risk takers.
No, in fact, there's almost something very intellectual about the way they take risk. It's, you know, I was talking to Greg Long, who's a very well-known big wave surfer, about how for him it's almost this intellectual endeavor of, here's this huge force of matter. How can I do this in a very intellectual way and minimize the risk and still be able to do this activity?
The markets that are working well in your book are they're free and open, where a lot of different participants, kind of work through things, and certain norms get kind of inscribed. I mean, on the one hand, that means when people from outside an industry come in and say, like, you guys are doing it all wrong, I'm going to bring, my outsider knowledge to bear on this. They typically don't work very well, or it doesn't last very long. But then also regulators often come in and figure they can tame a market. Is there something going on there about risk that regulators and kind of neophytes both dismiss.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I did that too, because I would go into these markets. I don't have any expertise in surfing or horse breeding. And I would always come in with, well, this is how we do it in finance. Have you thought about doing options on studs? And everyone's always like, no, of course not. This is not how it works. And of course, they were always right. But the regulation is hard because every community has this very strong libertarian streak. Like the big discussion at the Big Wave Surf Conference was about systemic risk. So systemic risk is that you're a big institution, you take a big risk, and you bring down the whole system. So this is the big debate in big wave surfing: is that is technology, be it jet skis or inflatable vests, encourage people to take on more risk, and that diverts rescue resources to other people, or you have people in the water crashing into other people, or it's a safety risk for people who have to rescue them. So it's in a sense a systemic risk. And so they're constantly debating who should be able to buy safety equipment and who should be surfing big waves. And I was like, well, we have these discussions in pension conferences, and it sounds like you're asking for some level of regulation. How should you be I asked them, should you be licensed to be a big wave surfer? Like the same way you're licensed to be a scuba diver. And this, as I said, they're all pretty liberal about most things. They're like, oh, the big wave, the inflatable vest company that sells vests to anyone, which they find very offensive because it means more risk for everyone. They're just about the money. But once I was like, well, do you think you should be regulated? Do you think big wave surfing should be licensed? They're like, no, we need to keep the government out of big wave surfing. They were very emphatic about that.
What is the big takeaway that you, because the book is also on a certain level is a self-help book or a personal finance book.
Yeah, personal finance gets a bad rap, especially in academic finance. But I think it's a bigger message than just personal finance, which is that people should feel more comfortable taking risks. We don't really give people the tools to feel comfortable with risk taking, but you really do need to take risks to make your life move forward in any aspect of your life. If it's a relationship, if it's your job, anything, is to help people understand that there is a way of taking risk where they can do stuff to protect themselves if things go wrong. There aren't any guarantees, but they can definitely increase the odds things will work out for them.